This is the Hasselblad 907X with the CFV100C digital back, and it's arguably one of the smallest, most beautiful looking and powerful cameras you can currently buy. But attached to the front is arguably something that's a little bit more exciting, because this is the newly announced XCD 3.4 75p, the company's smallest, lightest and cheapest portrait lens. Now together, I believe this makes for one hell of a combo and a package that's an absolute dream for any portrait or street photographer. Now we'll obviously get into the reasons why I think that in just a second, but firstly I need to clarify that whilst Hasselblad sent me both this camera and the lens for testing, they haven't paid me to make this video and they haven't told me what I can or can't say. So the opinions expressed in this video are entirely my own based on my experience whilst using this equipment. Anyway, this is the new XCD 75mm f3.4 lens, and it's the latest addition to Hasselblad's relatively new P series of lenses. And as tempting as it is to make jokes about this being the P series, I am going to try and resist the urge because this is a serious camera, okay? So for once, let's try and be serious. Anyway, it's important to know that Hasselblad currently has 3 lines of lenses. I've already spoken about its tiny P series, but just for some context, we should also talk about the other 2 ranges as well. So right at the top of the lens hierarchy, we have the E series, which are the flagship lenses, though currently there is only one of them available. And then sitting right on top of its P, there's a V series. The V series stands for versatile and is kind of the middle ground. These lenses offer a good balance between performance and portability. Anyway, being a P lens, as you may have already guessed, this is a reasonably lightweight and small portrait lens, and it's actually the first proper portrait lens for that series, offering the longest focal length and the largest aperture in the set. Not only that, but Hasselblad tells me that this lens offers, and I quote, a performance comparable to the XCD65, which is a lens that's almost double the price of this one. So how much does this lens cost? Well, it's a little under $2,230.
Off. Seriously.
And I know that may sound like a lot of money because it obviously is, but in the world of Hasselblad, believe me, that's a pretty damn good price. Now, being affordable is one thing, but if this isn't able to produce the goods, then you might as well have just tipped your $2,000 down the drain. So that's why I've decided to pair this lens with the equally portable but insanely powerful 907X and CFV100V digital back. Now, as the number in the name might already have given away, this camera can capture super high resolution 100 megapixel images. So if this lens really isn't up to scratch, then it should be abundantly clear when we look at the test photos a little later on. Now, this lens weighs in at just shy of 400 grams or 14.1 ounces, and that makes it almost half the weight of the XCD65 that I mentioned earlier, whilst also being slightly shorter in length. But like I always say, it's not the heft or length of your P that really matters. It's all about how it feels in your hand and how quickly it can perform. And luckily, this thing excels in both of those areas. Now, as you would expect from a Hasselblad, this lens is beautifully crafted and feels really nicely balanced even on the front of this super small camera body. It's got a pretty simplistic design with just a single focusing ring in the center here with no manual buttons or switches. Now, I am assuming that this is the result of Hasselblad trying to keep the weight and size and cost of this lens down, and to be fair, at no point did I find myself getting frustrated that there aren't any of these manual controls, and that's mainly because the touchscreen on the back of the camera is just awesome. It's so responsive and the interface is nice and clean and easy to navigate, especially for somebody who's never really used a Hasselblad camera before. Now, although this is a 75mm lens, because the sensor inside the CFV100C back is larger than full frame, it actually has a crop factor of 0.79 times, and that means that the end result will appear closer to that of a 60mm lens on a full frame camera, if we round the maths up a little bit. Now, personally, I am a huge fan of 50mm lenses, so this 60-ish millimeter equivalent is right up my street. Also, fun fact, this larger sensor will affect the appearance of the depth of field too. Now, whilst f3.4 probably doesn't sound like it would create a particularly shallow depth of field, if we multiply 3.4 by 0.79, we get 2.686, which is roughly what aperture you would need to set using a 60mm lens on a full frame camera to get the same kind of look. In other words, when shooting wide open, the images will look similar to something like a 60mm lens shot at f2.7 on a full frame camera or thereabouts. Now, just to be clear, here, the f-stop doesn't change, it's just the larger sensor captures more of the lens's image circle, creating a shallower perceived depth of field. I hope that makes sense. Basically though, in a very roundabout way, the point I'm trying to make is that this is a pretty nice setup for portraits. Also, something else that's kind of new to me here is that the camera itself doesn't actually have a mechanical shutter. Instead, Hasselblad installed leaf shutters inside the lenses themselves. And by using a leaf shutter rather than a focal plane shutter means that this thing can synchronize with external flash at any speed, which makes it easier to underexpose ambient light so that your subject really pops from the background. And that's something I'm absolutely desperate to try my hand at some point, but sadly I've left all of my flash equipment back in the UK, so until I get some new equipment, that might have to be something I have to save for a future video. But anyway, this also means that the maximum shutter speed you can achieve will vary depending on which lens you attach to the camera, and these P-series lenses all top out at 1/2000th of a second, which is obviously plenty fast enough for most types of photography. Now, speaking of speed, one thing I've always been warned about in the past is that medium format cameras and lenses aren't the fastest when it comes to autofocus. And whilst I found that the overall shooting pace whilst using this setup is certainly way slower than using my usual Sony a7C Mark II, that's not to say that this lens is a slouch. In fact, it's pretty snappy to lock onto the target. In low light, it will tend to take a little bit longer to find focus, but so long as you are locking onto areas of high contrast, I really didn't find it to be that much of a problem for me personally. But now we need to talk about the big one, image quality. Does this camera and lens combo really live up to the price tag? Well, starting with the positives, chromatic aberration is practically non-existent. In fact, I honestly can't remember the last time I tested a lens with results as clean as this. Though, to be fair, the lenses I normally test don't cost anywhere near as much as this one, so that was somewhat to be expected. Now, because the aperture maxes out at 3.4, getting a super shallow depth of field isn't going to be all that easy, at least not for your full or mid-length portraits. However, for environmental portraits like the ones that I was aiming to capture, this actually made it a pretty good pairing. That said, if you're all about the bokeh, then luckily this lens does have a fairly short minimum focusing distance of 55 centimeters, which is perfectly close enough for tight headshots. And obviously, if you shoot at this close distance, it will start to produce a thicker background blur, which looks perfectly pleasant enough. Now, the day that I picked to go shooting with this thing happened to be a super bright cloudless day, so there were lots of deep shadows in the trees and mountains, as well as super bright highlights in the sky and reflected off the water. So not the easiest of conditions, but I figured that this would be a pretty good situation to really put this camera and lens through its paces. And when shooting against the bright sunlight, you can see that this lens does show some signs of flaring, but really nothing all that overbearing and far from being the worst results I've ever seen. I was also shooting with the included metal lens hood, which certainly helped to protect against flaring when the sun was to my side. Overall though, I've got to say, the sharpness of this lens when shooting wide open is insanely impressive. The level of detail you can pull out from these 100 megapixel raw files is insane, and such a step up from any of the other cameras that I'm used to shooting with. The only real criticism that I have about this lens is it does seem to create a noticeable vignette around the edges of the frame, though for portraits this isn't always a bad thing. And if you aren't a fan of that look, it's actually pretty easy to remove vignetting using the standard lens correction sliders in Lightroom or Photoshop. Now, whilst this is certainly a very impressive lens and camera combo, even with the lower price tag of this lens, I think it's fair to say that this setup is still way beyond the reach for most people. However, Hasselblad's evident effort to lower the entry barrier, at least for its lenses, whilst maintaining the quality you would expect, I think is only a good thing. Who knows, maybe in a few decades we'll be all casually snapping 100 megapixel selfies with insane cameras like this, but until then, I'm gonna have to put this down very gently and try not to think too much about the fact that that's worth more than my car.